Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I'm glad to open the second day of our conference, Reshaping the Nation. We already got better weather today, so it's all going to be more optimistic, I guess. So today we are going to discuss in our first panel the topic Creating Ethnicity. And I have the honor to welcome here Aleksandra Pomiecko and Ondřej Matějka. And the first speaker is Aleksandra Pomiecko from the University of Toronto. In her dissertation, she was focusing on the Belarusian nationalist armed groups and networks from 1921 to 1956. Her research interest centers around conflict, warfare, intelligence in the global 20th century, and her next project examines the Western intelligence-sponsored covert operations in the Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So the floor is yours.
Can anyone? Yes, okay. So firstly, thank you to the organizers for putting this conference together. I think yesterday was very, very fruitful, and so thank you for the invitation to come here and speak about my research that draws a lot from what my dissertation was about. Anti-Soviet, anti-Polish, anti-Bolshevik, these were some of the labels Belarusian nationalists used to define themselves throughout the Second World War, and more precisely during the period of German occupation from 1941 to 1944. The year 1944 and into 1945 was a critical period for Belarusian nationalists and other national groups, as it marked a culmination of experiences during the German occupation, and it also prompted many to think about the post-war period, especially as it became evident that the Germans were losing the war. This critical juncture prompted different nationalist and collaborationist groups to think about their futures in the post-war period, and in the case of Belarusian nationalists, this came with an additional concern, mainly whether or not the Belarusian project would survive after the war was over. The fundamental question of my presentation is, how did these individuals understand their roles and their nation at this critical juncture during the war? And sort of tangentially to this larger question, how did their previous experiences condition them or inform their decisions during the later period? When I say Belarusian nationalists, I am referring to a very specific group of individuals who collaborated with the Germans during the war and were for the most part anti-Soviet in orientation. They envisioned an independent Belarus, though the particular ideological or political vision of such a potential state remained pretty varied among different actors of this particular network. Aside from their collective desire to unify Belarusian territory and be removed from the larger hegemony of any larger state, there was little else that commonly unified these actors. In the context of armed military formations, many times these nationalists expressed a desire to create conscious soldiers, świadomie soldaty. Yet what that meant remained very vague and open-minded. Their activity during the Second World War was significantly shaped by their earlier experiences living in the Second Polish Republic or in other Belarusian émigré centers across Europe, including here in Prague, where there was a very prominent Belarusian community in the interwar period. It was their experiences prior to the war that had a significant impact, and I would argue, a more significant role than their allegiance to Belarusian independence or Belarusian nationalism. For example, one thing that bound some of these individuals was a feeling of exclusion in their earlier lives. Two of these Belarusian nationalist groups and leaders' most important individuals, Borys Rachulia and Usiewala Dorodzka, had applied during the interwar period to take their entrance exams into the medical school in the Second Polish Republic. Borys Rachulia describes his experience in his memoir, which he later published in 2005, and I'm quoting an excerpt from this memoir. After passing my final exams at the gymnasium, I took special preparatory courses to upgrade my science credits. I planned to take my medical school examinations in Vilnius in late August, and then attend the Stefan Batory University. only 100 out of 1,600 applicants were accepted to medical school, and only 5 placements were available to minorities: Belarusians, Jews, Ukrainians, and Lithuanians. Imagine my exultation when I learned that I had been accepted. My mother and I danced around our small apartment. It was one of the happiest days of our lives. My friends Janka Hutor, Usiewa Ladrocka, whom we called Vova, and a fellow named Sławicki would also be joining me in Vilnius. Although Sławicki was Pole, we included him in our small circle of friends, and we enjoyed discussing everything with him, including politics. But then my dream of attending medical school began to disintegrate. I received a letter from the armed forces notifying me that I had to begin my reserve training on the 5th of September 1938. If I refused, they said, I would be charged with desertion. We soon learned what had gone wrong. Several influential Polish nationalists had intervened when they learned that 3 Belarusians had won the coveted places at the university. I seethed inwardly, unable to accept the injustice of it. A few weeks later, the university notified me that another candidate would be taking my place. Later, I came to realize that we could turn this predicament to our advantage. We could use our military training to further the cause of Belarusian political and cultural autonomy, end quote. This experience at having been slighted by the state and in their potential careers left an impactful mark on the young men. But of course, Rahulio was talking about his experience over 6 years later in his memoir, and so this inevitably affected how he saw this earlier experience as a young man. There were other experiences of exclusion that affected many of these prominent Belarusian leaders and would affect sort of their actions during the Second World War. Another group of young men that later became very prominent during the German occupation all met in one particular Belarusian homeschool in Niezwisz, which was unofficially created when all of the non-ethnic Polish schools in the region were banned by the state. Though merely young teenagers, these connections that such actors formed earlier in their lives would prove very important for years to come. And it was these experiences and connections that would become the ideology or some sort of emulsifying agent or bond that drew these individuals together. Oftentimes during the war, higher-ranking Belarusians were posted in their hometowns in order to foster a sense of loyalty or bond with their local community. They would appoint childhood friends that were often less qualified to carry out administrative obligations, but this encouraged a sort of bond with their community and gave them a sort of presence and legitimacy where they were working. When thinking primarily about the development or attempt at development of Belarusian nationalism, these actors in positions of power approached the issue mainly in 2 ways and in 2 phases. First, during the earlier years of the war, they favored ethnic Belarusians, or those deemed to be ethnic Belarusians, in everyday situations. And secondly, during the later phases of the war, they created educational programs with the intention of Belarusifying locals and their alleged constituents. So in this first earlier phase of the war, tensions between Belarusian leaders and non-Belarusians came through at the local level, often sort of encouraged by the German administration. When Germans required labor to be sent away to other occupied areas, Belarusian leaders that were in charge of these regional places would volunteer ethnic Poles or ethnic Russians to do the job. And there are many confessions later on, and these I've seen at the CIA documents, where Belarusian individuals would admit that they had sent who they thought were, let's say, Polish intelligentsia to be sent to labor camps or whatnot. Eliminating non-Belarusians, however, did not necessarily aid in the promotion or development of Belarusian nationalism or identity. Education was also intended to promote Belarusian awareness, or świadomość. A number of organizations, always subordinate to the Germans, of course, were created throughout the war. The Belarusian Self-Help Organization, which provided sort of social aid and healthcare to locals, was one of them. But by 1944, the efforts to Belarusify locals moved away from physically removing non-Belarusians and instead shifted its focus to education and commemoration practices. In 1944, 2 groups were particularly targeted: the youth and soldiers. And so the soldiers were more my topic of my interest topic throughout my dissertation and in this paper. The Belarusian Home Defense, Belaruskaya Krajovaya Obrona, or BKA for short, was created on the 23rd of February 1944, and it came after other armed organizations that had been created and disbanded earlier during the war. The Belarusian Auxiliary Police, the Belarusian Self-Defense Corps, which only lasted 1 year. And so these higher-ranking Belarusian officials had some experience in training soldiers. With the BKA in 1944, however, these higher-up Belarusian nationalists really pushed for pedagogical aspects of military training. They focused increasingly on teaching soldiers the Belarusian language. They often gave lectures on Belarusian history and Belarusian politics, the struggle of the Belarusian. And furthermore, they paired these educational parts of the training with commemoration practices, harking back to anti-Bolshevik or anti-Polish uprisings, organized in the 1920s by Belarusians or alleged Belarusians. They would often have speakers that were still living from an earlier 1920 uprising to come and speak to soldiers, to motivate them, elevating sort of the importance and the historical tradition of Belarusian military armed formations. Therefore, this 1944 to 1945 moment, from what I understand, became sort of a watershed moment in the history of Belarusian nationalism. It was a peak year for education and of the Belarusification of individuals, particularly of youths and rank-and-file soldiers. Aside from education, however, the emphasis on family became increasingly strong in 1944. For example, when Belarusian leaders, such as Boris Rahulia, would go to other regions of Belarus in order to try to recruit, sometimes forcibly, individuals, he would say that it was never too late, and I'm quoting, "It's never too late to fight for one's family and nation." The families of soldiers who were fighting would often receive extra rations or benefits by the Belarusian leadership and by the Germans. Sometimes this came through extra rations, but sometimes this came through help. In the case of, let's say, a Soviet partisan group would attack the family would get another plot of land or sometimes be relocated. Sometimes help would be sent to this family to help when they were with the land that they were living on. So there were benefits that the leadership tried to cater to in order to keep these people in these battalions. And this focus on family became increasingly the sort of emulsifying agent, the link to some sort of Belarusian identity, and became increasingly more important, especially when surrounded by other, arguably more stronger and more numerous national groups, such as Poles, Ukrainians, and Lithuanians. However, this climax of opportunity that came in 1944 and 1945 also came at an increased price, namely involvement in violence through anti-partisan operations, and intimately participating in the murder of Jews and other locals. So there's a sort of proportional relationship between the attempt to develop Belarusian nationalism, but also the involvement of violence during this time. The shift in 1944 and 1945 in many ways reflects the original elements that linked individuals together prior to the war: experiences of exclusion, friendship, the family home, through education, through these networks, and not being able to go to medical school, for example. And perhaps it reveals that the only way to keep alive the vision of Belarusian identity and nationalism was through family and kinship, and not through how most scholars, for example, see this traditional development of nationalism in Eastern Europe. This does not undermine Belarusian nationalism during this time or the development of it, but shows perhaps just a different understanding of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very interesting paper about the national consciousness in the Belarusian home defense. The next speaker, Andrzej Maciejka, is from the Charles University in Prague. He studied history at École Normale Supérieure in Paris, in Princeton University and University of Geneva, where he got his PhD. And here, right now, he taught contemporary European history and methodology of social sciences at the Institute of Area Studies at the Charles University here in Prague. And he also collaborates regularly with the Department of History of the University of Geneva. And his research is focused on the social and cultural history of region in the Czech lands, generational history, the encounter of national and transnational dynamics around educational modernization, and history of psychotherapy. And at our conference, he's going to speak about the topic between the nation and the region, Czech Protestants and the transfer of Sudeten Germans between 1945 and 1948.
Thank you. Thank you very much for introduction, and thanks for the invitation to this conference. My objective is to offer a case study on the effects of the war-related reshaping of national communities living in Bohemian lands on one specific group, which is Czech Protestant milieu. And this milieu for centuries existed in the borderline zone between Czech-speaking and German-speaking inhabitants of Bohemian lands, so it's a sort of interesting actor in this reshaping, in those reshaping times. In my presentation, I will proceed in three parts. First of all, I will introduce very shortly the evolution of this borderline position of Czech Protestants from the end of the 18th century until the beginning of the World War II. The second part will focus on what was happening in post-May 45 weeks and months in this Czech Protestant community in relation to the expulsion of German-speaking population. And in the third part, I will outline two ambivalent effects of this expulsion and Czech Protestant attitudes towards it in a longer run, in the post-war decades. So let me start with a short overview of the existence of Czech-speaking Protestants in the Bohemian lands between two growingly antagonistic, linguistic and progressively nationalized communities. In fact, to go very quickly, Czech Protestants legally returned to public space in Bohemia only in the end of the 18th century, after approximately 150 years of oppression. The result of the successful Habsburg Recatholicization campaign was that Protestants who reappeared in the end of the 18th century constituted a very small minority, 2 to 3% of the population, and they lived mostly in remote and poor regions of the monarchy. Furthermore, they continued to be socially disadvantaged until the full emancipation in 1861. So they were heavily dependent on foreign aid, which came during the 19th century mainly from German Protestants, from mainland Germany, so to say. They sponsored these German Protestants sponsored the construction of Czech Protestant churches, schools, presbyteries, but also in some cases contributed to salaries of pastors. Furthermore, Czech pastors did not have any theological faculty in the Bohemian lands, so all of them went or had to go to study abroad. All of them had to pass through Vienna, but almost 90% of Czech pastors continued during their study years to German universities. Thanks a lot. So this is the second half of the 19th century, and roughly at the same time, Czech and German-speaking inhabitants of the Bohemian lands began to define themselves as two distinct national communities who grew antagonistic in the second half of the 19th century. It is important to mention that the Czech nationalists, most of them more or less mild Catholics, used in the construction of their national narrative historical interpretations formulated by historian František Palacký, who elevated non-Catholic parts of Bohemian history into the rank of main formative events of this territory, mainly the Hussite revolt. So to sum up, at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, we have Czech nationalist mainstream swearing by Hus, yet at the same time remaining in the Catholic Church and fighting the German danger, and a small Czech-speaking Protestant milieu wishing to claim its specific part in the national community due to historical reasons. They proclaimed themselves the most Czech of all Czechs, but they were financially and intellectually heavily dependent on German Protestants, and German Protestants themselves were hostile to Czech nationalists, so it was quite a conflicting constellation. Consequently, the Czech Protestants, when they tried to act more assertively in Czech society, were repeatedly attacked by Czech nationalist media as, quote, agents of the Prussian king. It is interesting to notice that since the 1880s they found an important support in another marginal, mostly hated by Czech nationalists, Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, and Czech Protestants became his faithful political allies ever since. When this formerly marginal figure became the president of the newly created Czechoslovak Republic in 1918, Czech Protestants came closer from the margins to the center. So it led to a sort of stabilization of their milieu. Yet they did not give in to reigning nationalism and succeeded in keeping relatively good relations with local German-speaking Protestants who formed an independent Deutsche Evangelische Kirche, German Evangelic Church in Czechoslovakia in 1919, and also with Protestants in Germany, in Weimar Germany. It all got complicated after 1933, when the most internationally active Czech Protestant elite, who really substantially influenced all the milieu, became faithful supporters of the anti-Nazi confessing church in Germany, and parallelly the German-speaking Protestants in Czechoslovak Republic became heavily Nazified. Consequently, during the World War II, these two communities grew really antagonistic. An important number of Czech Protestants joined, mainly the elite, joined the resistance groups, while the German Evangelic Church enthusiastically welcomed the incorporation of Bohemian lands into Nazi power sphere. So this leads me to my second part. In May 1945, German-speaking Protestants were rather vulnerable, while their Czech-speaking correligionaries found themselves in a relatively safe position due to their impeccable war record. Yet it soon appeared that their borderline position exposed them to some difficult choices in a time of the explosion of Czech nationalist violence, which culminated in the weeks and months of the so-called white expulsion of Sudeten Germans. At those dramatic times, Czech Protestants tried to balance and somehow remain faithful to their different allegiances, conflicting loyalties, if I dare to say, and I tried to very schematically put them in two categories. First of all, Czech Protestants were Christians, and this religious identification underpinned their attitudes to the acts of post-war violence. Proceedings of the first post-war synod, the decisive leading body of the church, shows how they tried, on the one hand, to protest against public manifestations of violence, public executions, for instance, but going further and touching to matters related to violent practices around the expulsion of German-speaking population proved to be very difficult. And I chose one particular topic of the debate during the synod around Přemysl Peter, which I consider a telling example. Peter was a social worker and a convinced pacifist close to the Protestant church, even though he was never a member of the Protestant church. And he was always ready to help those who were in trouble since the interwar period, for instance, Jewish families during the occupation. And for this, he was recognized by Yad Vashem as one of the righteous among nations in the 60s. But if we get back to the 1940s, immediately after the end of the war, he started the so-called castles operation. In fact, as a member of the Czech National Council, he acquired several castles, or he was put in charge of several castles around Prague, left by their German owners, and he transformed them into sanatoriums for Jewish children returning from the concentration camps. That was the original project. But when he became acquainted with the alarming situation in Czech internment camps for German-speaking populations, where hundreds of children were dying from malnutrition, dysentery, etc., he decided to offer refuge for some of those German-speaking children as well. So in the end, Peter took care of around 800 children. Half of them were Germans, half of them were Jewish. And the reaction of Czech nationalists was predictably harsh. They wrote denunciation letters to state authorities. They started a hateful campaign in the media. They even attacked Peter in public. And it is interesting to observe the reaction of Czech Protestant milieu in this context. In fact, during the session of the Synod in 1945, there were two opposing groups, those who called for a clear and unambivalent declaration of support for Peter as an exemplary Christian, and those who warned, let us remember, that's a quote from the proceedings, let us remember that we were accused of working for the Prussian king. So the 19th century anxiety sort of returned in the 1945 debate. And it is important to notice that the second position prevailed, and there was no explicit public Protestant support for Peter coming from the Czech Protestant Church officially. A little bit later, several months later, another actor entered into this complicated networks of identifications, affiliations, loyalties, and anxieties. The Provisional World Council of Churches in Geneva followed very carefully transfers of populations and violent practices in Central Europe, and decided to criticize them publicly in a protest resolution addressed also to the Czech Protestants, who were very much engaged in this World Council of Churches, in this Provisional World Council of Churches. And once again, this memorandum very much upset Czech nationalist mainstream, and its hateful reaction provoked again a true wave of panic among Czech Protestants. In response to this memorandum from Geneva, the leadership of the Czech Protestants published a booklet in Czech and in English, theologically and historically justifying the expulsion as a necessary and unavoidable measure. Another reaction to this World Council of Churches memorandum: after the German torturing of our nation, it is unimaginable to keep these persecutors in our country. That's a quote from a Synodal Council memorandum related to this World Council message, World Council of Churches. However, on the local ground, the reality was much more varied and complicated. In correspondence between former pastors of the German Protestant Church in Czechoslovakia and the authorities of Czech Protestant Church, we find numerous proofs of acts of help from the side of those Czech pastors, local Czech pastors, who functioned with the benediction of the leadership of the church as mediators between local authorities and German-speaking Protestants before the expulsion. Those Czech pastors even transferred money from foreign supporters to members of the German Protestant Church, some money also coming from Geneva, and mediated communication between those German-speaking Protestants who were still in the Bohemian lands and those who were already in Germany. They sometimes went through Red Cross, but sometimes also used the international ecumenical church infrastructure. Motivations were, of course, complex. I could go back to the first part. There is this Christian dimension, there is this pressure coming from Geneva, but there is also a very personal history of long-time acquaintances. Czech and German pastors in Bohemia, of course, knew each other for decades, but, and that's my last point in this part, there were also more material issues at stake, mainly churches, schools, social care institutions, which the German Protestant Church in Czechoslovakia left behind. And in 1945, Czech Protestants were very much interested in this property because they sensed both the great opportunity to carry out, as I quote from 1945, Czechization and evangelization at the same time, but they simultaneously sensed the grave dangers connected to the high mobility, which shook the relatively well-functioning Czech Protestant milieu. So there was anxiety of not possessing an infrastructure large and solid enough to contain movements accompanying the social-political earthquake of 1945 that also motivated these material efforts. So this leads me to my last part, long-term consequences of the transfer for the Czech Protestants. In fact, the Protestant story is, of course, only a detail in a larger picture of massive post-war movements in the Bohemian lands, involving millions of inhabitants of the Bohemian lands. And the Protestant case can uncover some of the interesting social consequences of those movements in reshaping social identities and identifications. Just to get a hint of the dimensions of the movement in Czech Protestant Church, in reaction to this great post-war migration, people moving from the borderlands to Germany and then from mainland Bohemia to the borderlands, 62 new parishes were established in order to contain the geographical reconfiguration of the Czech Protestant milieu, which meant a rise by almost 30% in the number of Czech Protestant parishes. But it was a very demanding operation and personnel was missing. There was everywhere a shortage of pastors in borderline regions. This is a quote from Synod in 1946. There are 60 new places where the gospel should be proclaimed and for which we do not have enough staff. The other side of the coin, so to say, was that local overpopulation was complemented by the equally dramatic phenomena of depopulation in certain regions of mainland Bohemia and Moravia. The migration wave towards Sudeten regions hit especially hard the traditional Protestant strongholds in Valašsko and Vysočina, in those relatively poor parts of the Bohemian lands, where Protestants were very solidly installed since the end of the 18th century. And certain parishes precisely in those traditional Protestant regions lost between 20 and 30% of members in the first 5 months after the end of the war, who moved to the borderland regions with the vision of having an easier life in the regions deserted by the German population. Despite concentrated efforts, containing Protestants suddenly rooted out from their parishes and starting a new life without immediately attainable church facilities in the borderland proved to be an impossible task. Until today, ex-Sudeten regions remain not only some of the weakest parts of the Protestant church milieu, but belong also among the most secularized regions of the Czech Republic. If I dare a schematic generalization, transfer and resettlement is an important chapter also in the history of Central European secularization. But, and that's my last point, the consequences of the transfer proved to be yet more complicated in the case of Czech Protestants. Due to long-lasting history of close Czech-German Protestant relations, but also thanks to relatively correct attitude of Czech Protestants during the expulsion of their German-speaking brothers and sisters, contacts between Czech and German Protestants were not interrupted, even after the communist coup d'etat in 1948. This open channel of contact became a very specific resource, mainly in the first decade of the Cold War, when relationships between Czechoslovakia and West Germany were very complicated, and mediators between the two states constituted a very rare and thus precious species. I want to illustrate it with the help of a document that I found in the archives of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia from summer 1957. At that moment, despite continuing Cold War tensions, Czechoslovak communist leaders felt always more acutely the necessity of deepening economic exchanges with Western Europe, West Germany included. In the discussion around a business-oriented file on Czech-German relations, the leaders of the Czech Communist Party thus very much appreciated the fact that and this is quote, relations between the Protestant churches of both countries, Czechoslovakia and West Germany, are significant. Hromádka, the leading figure in Czech Protestant milieu, is especially well known in West Germany as a distinguished Protestant theologian of world reputation. We use the relations between the Protestant churches to make contacts with prominent persons of political life being active in these churches. At present time, it is the only possibility for direct contact with the West German government. End of quote. This possibility to mediate between communist Czechoslovakia and Western Germany and more generally Western world constituted a particular kind of political capital which proved to be convertible into other resources in the context of the communist dictatorship. For instance, into a kind of protective shield which helped Protestant milieu in times of sometimes harsh anti-religious campaigns which hit, for instance, Czech Catholic milieu harder. Let me conclude. I presented the destinies of a traditionally borderline, from national point of view, confessional community at the moment of substantial and violent redrawing of the borders of national communities. We can observe, thanks to this case study, ambivalent effects in two directions. And I want to underline once again what I mentioned in the third part. In the uprooted regions, it proved very difficult to keep religious identity, religious belonging, church belonging. If I return to one of the slogans that I quoted from 1945, Czechization of the borderlands did not lead to evangelization. In fact, the nationalization sort of led to downward tendencies in church milieu. And on the other hand, the ethnic homogenization of the territory sort of appreciated the specific capital of Czech Protestant milieu, a sort of international social capital based on the long existence between Czech and German-speaking communities. Thanks, among else, to their relatively decent attitude during the violent phases of expulsion of Czech Protestants, kept open doors to their German co-religionaries, and so Czech Protestant milieu could play a bridging role even at the times when most of other bridges were inaccessible. Thank you for your attention.
I would like to thank you both for your time discipline. And right now we have time for discussion. I guess that's about half an hour until 10:30 or something about that. So there's a lot of time for discussion. We heard a lot about the national identities, about reshaping them in the time between 1944 and 1946, and about the importance of history that became also, again, a very important player in that time. And there's a first question. I guess I will collect them, so if someone else wants the first one.
Two questions.
I want to interrupt you. Maybe we can use the microphone. Can I ask Jakub to? Thank you very much. There's the other one.
Hello. One question for each presentations. For Mrs. Pomnieczko, how this Nazi or nationalist nation-building process overlapped or antagonized or in between with a parallel Nazi national building process undertook by the Soviet state, and they refer to it at the same time. It's a difference of region. I mean, ex-Polish lands towards against versus so ex-Soviet or something more. And the second question is for Mr. Matejka. You mentioned mainstream nationalists and their reactions towards the Protestants. Who were there? Can you be more specific? And what was the attitude of the Communist Party and the communists in general at that time towards this question?
Professor Rahman.
Thank you for the interesting papers. Alexandra, I wanted to ask you about, I mean, you basically set this up as kind of the Belarusian nationalists against the partisans. And the partisans, some were a lot of them were Belarusians, right? And what their sense of Belarusian nationality or nationalism, how did that differ? I mean, you know, what was their perspective on this? I mean, I assume they were kind of pro-Soviet Belarusians who recognized their Belarusian difference, but to what extent? And the question for Andre has to do with, I was a little bit unclear from what you said, whether the Czech Protestants acted any differently than the Czech Catholics in this expulsion. I mean, can you make some kind of generalizations? I mean, you point out that in some cases, you know, they were sympathetic to the Germans and, you know, helped them out, and a few pastors, you know, passed on some money and that sort of thing. But I assume the Czech Catholics weren't uniformly, you know, hateful in expulsion of the Germans. Can you make some generalizations about the two communities and how they dealt with the expulsions?
Thank you. So maybe I will give time for the answers right now, and then we will go on.
Thank you for the questions. I think I can actually answer both at the same time. They kind of pair well together. So there definitely is a regional difference. The group of individuals I studied were mainly active during the interwar period in Poland or in other Western European cities, like I said here, in Warsaw, in Paris to some extent, so in Berlin. So they did have sort of a different approach. And then just because of the nature of occupation, the administrative versus the military, direct military occupation in Eastern Belarus, there were differences sort of in ideology. So there certainly were Soviet visions that Belarusians ascribed by, and that came through the Soviet partisans, Belarusian partisans, which was an incredibly very strong movement. And it was part of sort of the larger Soviet anti-Nazi, anti-German struggle. However, it's not uniform, and that doesn't mean that there wasn't any crossover between some of the rank and file people that fought for the Germans that may have switched over to Soviet partisans, and vice versa, or even to the Polish Armia Krajowa. So it's not so isolated that these people remain in their groups necessarily the whole time. It's difficult to assess sort of what rank and file soldiers thought because we don't have material from them besides maybe some petitions or letters that they would write of complaints. But it does have to do primarily with the regional differences. And then at the really top, higher ranking individual level, which I studied more, it has to do because of the way that they were raised and where they lived in the interwar period. Although there were some individuals from this particular network who had lived in interwar Soviet Belarus that felt repressed a lot or had seen sort of, especially in the 1930s, had seen a lot of their comrades or whatever be repressed. And they later turned towards the Germans during the Second World War, but mainly regional. And yes, the Soviet Belarusian partisans were certainly more Soviet in orientation. There were differences, I'm sure, as well, depending on different regions or grievances or what had happened to the particular village during the war. But sometimes they were Soviet because they disliked living under the Poles during the interwar period, and so that sort of pushed them towards the Soviet partisan cause. But yeah.
Thank you. I will try to go in the order of the questions as I got them. Mainstream nationalists, yes, it's a schematic expression that I used mainly for the turn of the 19th and 20th century, and I would say that I mean by that the absolute majority of Czech political representations, and I tried to show that really the only ally accessible to Czech Protestants in this particular moment was another marginal, a political marginal that had a different attitude towards this dominant nationalist discourse, which was Masaryk. So there was really, I would say, almost the entire Czech political scene minus Masaryk. But it's a simplification. The other question around Communist Party and the position of the Communist Party in 1945 and in relation to the Protestant Church is a really interesting question because in fact, of course, Communist Party was one of the main actors of Czech nationalism in those post-war months and years, claiming the heritage, the most progressive heritage of Czech history, which was the title of one of the famous booklets published in immediate post-war period, Communists as the inheritors of the most progressive traditions, which were, of course, among else also the non-Catholic, the Protestant traditions. So there was, in a way, a discursive, we could see it as a concurrent, but also as a coalition between communists and Protestants. But it was further complicated by the fact, or further enriched by the fact that the Czech Protestants had a specific relationships towards the Communist Party from the interwar period, which was based on an anti-national compromise or anti-national understanding during the interwar period. So it's a paradoxical, in fact, situation, because the Czech Protestants got closer to Czech communists during the interwar period on the non-nationalist or anti-nationalist or internationalist basis. They, for instance, collaborated together in various initiatives related to support of democratic Spain or Republican Spain in the interwar period. But in the immediately post-war period in 1945, this sort of internationalist compromise got very much complicated by the nationalization of the Communist Party. So it's an interesting question, but very intricate sort of network of historical background and the actual what was going on in 1945. So in fact, some of the representatives of Czech Protestants, including Petr, found themselves in a very complicated position in 1945, because Petr himself, the pacifist that I mentioned with the Casas project, was close to communist milieu in interwar period, yet after 45 one of his main opponents came from the Communist Party who criticized very much his attitude to those German children. So that's an interesting story, but quite complicated. For this third question, the comparison between Czech Protestants and the Catholic attitude, I would say I'm not really able to make a very qualified generalization, but I would say that on the local level there were not probably big differences between local acts of help coming from Czech Catholic milieu to their German Catholic brothers and sisters. But I would say that the difference is the international context and the implication of Czech Protestants or the history of the Czech-German Protestant relationships. This was something very different from the Catholic milieu, because Czech Protestants had a history of dependence on the German Protestant world from the pre-1918 period, which was not really the case of Czech Catholic milieu. So that's the interesting difference that also I think that some of the motivations for the help for German Protestants in post-war period, in post-1945 period, was related to this longer history of Czech-German relations, which was the difference from Catholic milieu. So there is this common point on Christian attitude in the times of extreme violence, but there is this difference, I would say, in the sphere of longer relations and historical connections between Czech and German Protestant milieus, which is specific for the Czech Protestant case. Okay.
Thank you. So very satisfied with the answers. Okay. So there are next questions. I'm sorry, but there were people before. Okay, so go on. Professor Anders, go on.
Up to now, I thought that white Russian nationalists were a very tiny group. I would like to know whether this tiny group comes from the same families who supported white Russian nationalism during World War I. And then I would like to hear from you something with comparing the Russian and the Ukrainian nationalism, which are in the same situation, somehow in the same situation. The Ukrainian nationalists could have been the only possible supporter of the white Russian nationalists. The Soviets not, the Germans are losing the war, and so on.
So there was the other. There.
Thank you very much. I have also two quick questions to Alexandra, and my first question is connected to previous question. Yeah, I'm interested in, maybe you know some information about contacts between Belarusian nationalists and Ukrainian nationalists, because we have some documents, and this position, anti-Soviet position, could join them and force them to cooperation in some cases. But I also have documents when, despite of agreement, Belarusian nationalists raped, for example, Ukrainian members of Ukraine underground, and it was conflict between them. Maybe you know better about this. And the second question is connected with anti-Jewish violence. You mentioned that Belarusian nationalists were involved in anti-Jewish violence, and I'm wondering about this period of February-March 1944, because in Ukrainian case, Ukrainian nationalists were involved, they were hunting Jews and killed Jews in hiding, because Red Army was approached and they afraid that Jewish community will cooperate with Soviet authority. Thank you very much.
Also notice the last question from Professor Bauer. Okay, so.
Miroslav Kunštad. I have a question for Ondřej Matějka. You have mentioned that the Czech Protestants, before the war, preferred contacts to the confession church, bekennende Kirche, in contrast to the Sudeten German Protestants, which prefer the contacts to the Deutsche Evangelische Kirche. I have found some years ago in Bundesarchiv, in the files of Reichskirchenministerium, some new reports, I think from Gauleitung, with some gravamina, or the complaint that the new coming pastors from Germany to the empty communities, to the empty parish in the Sudeten German Evangelical Church, are mostly under the influence of bekennende Kirche. I haven't found anything in the book of Maria Hanke Probst, and maybe do you know about these contacts of Czech Protestants to this thin strata of pastors in border areas in the wartime, which belong to the bekennende Kirche? That's a very interesting topic.
So, go for the answers.
Thank you. These are really excellent questions, and many that I was grappling with when I was writing my dissertation. I'll start with the connections between Belarusian nationalists in the First World War and the Second World War. But to preface that, you're absolutely right. This is a minority group. It's a very small group of individuals that are pushing for an independent Belarus. So it's not in any way comparable to the Polish national movement or Ukrainian national movement. In terms of connections between sort of these Belarusian nationalists, at least the higher ranking ones in the First World War and Second World War, there certainly were connections. Many of them survived and were very active in these battalions. They were the ones doing these commemorative speeches. So people like Abramczyk, spent most of his time in Paris, went to Belarus during the Second World War, or Radoslav Astravsky, who was the president of this Belarusian puppet government during the Second World War, very active during the First World War. So there definitely is an overlap between the wars and these individuals that were operating between those two. In terms of this Ukrainian, Belarusian connection, so I think to preface that, there's a distinction that needs to be made, is that I'm talking about German-sponsored groups. In Belarus, although many people would like to claim, Belarusians would like to claim that there was sort of a Belarusian partisan movement, if it existed, we don't have any figures for it, and it wasn't, certainly not as prominent as UPA. So it's difficult to compare UPA with any sort of Belarusian counterpart. There are indications of communication between Ukrainian nationalists and Belarusians, but it's really only, as far as I've been able to find, only found in memoirs. There's one by Bulba Barabiec. So he wrote this memoir about allegedly meeting someone, but this was in the late 30s. So it was quite before the German occupation of Belarus. And they allegedly met, he met some Belarusian nationalists, and they were thinking about sort of, from the Belarusian perspective, they were really interested in the model in which ON was operating, and they were trying to develop Belarusian nationalism in this way. But beyond that, I don't have much more concrete evidence of any sort of cooperation. Unless, sometimes they would trade arms. I know that, you see in these documents, like, they gave us some food, we gave them some weapons, and that kind of communication. As far as anti-Jewish violence, I don't know, in terms of sexual violence, I can't speak to that, because I haven't seen those documents, but I know, and I've heard in the archives in Ukraine, there's quite a bit about Belarusian involvement in that. It's hard to tell if these are Belarusians in the Soviet partisan movement, or these are Belarusians in these groups. So that's something that I would be really interested in knowing more about or looking at those documents. In terms of, though, anti-partisan operations, which obviously affected Jews and other locals, it was just a sort of a name for that. What I will say is that there were a lot of other national groups operating on Belarusian territory. And in many cases, you'd have a lot of Latvian battalions coming in and doing this anti-Jewish violence to the same extent as Belarusians. I've seen some complaints from the Germans saying that the Belarusians were not effective enough in killing locals or in these anti-partisan operations, so they would bring in Latvian, Lithuanian, sometimes Ukrainian divisions to sort of do the job. But as far as specifically the sexual violence and just in reaction to the Red Army killing Jews for that purpose, I haven't found so much evidence about that from the Belarusian perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be very quick. I will be very grateful to learn more about what you mentioned, because from my perspective of Czech archives of Czech Protestant Church, I haven't found a trace of a phenomenon like this. But this sounds really, really interesting. So thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions left? So if not, I will use the opportunity. So we were talking, or the name of the panel is Creating Ethnicity. And ethnicity should be something, or states are trying to define that in an objective way, that ethnicity is something objective that somehow exists, really. But at the same time, we heard a lot about these identities, national identities that are competing each other about loyalties and stuff like that. So I would like to ask both of you, how was the notion of ethnicity changing at the end of the war? So in your topics, in your research, is that even a topic for you? And if yes, how can you answer? So how was ethnicity? Was ethnicity important? And what was the connection between ethnicity and these other loyalties, identities, and other feelings of the people in that time?
So I don't think I have an answer for this, as was, I hope, more or less evident in my talk. There's a sense that there needs to be an understanding of what Belarusian ethnicity is, or Belarusian identity is. They're not the same thing, but I don't think this is ever really resolved, and as much as they sort of push for a particular avenue to create some sort of model for the development of Belarusian ethnicity, I think this is never really resolved, and the best they can do is sort of create something via kinship, mutual interests, mutual enemies, and this is unfortunately not a very satisfying answer, but I think in my case, there's not much I can say about something being articulated very, very well by the end of the war, or even into the post-war period.
Thank you.
Thanks for a difficult concluding question. Well, what comes to my mind is that, of course, the ethnicity or national identity is a key concept in the debates of my Czech Protestants in 1945, from the perspective that they try, rather with no great success, to sort of relativize the actual predominance of this ethnic identity or identification in the post-war months and years. They try somehow to claim that there are other different allegiances, loyalties, identifications, for instance, confessional or religious identification. And, well, my story is a little bit about trying to create a space for other types of identification in times when the ethnic identification becomes the completely predominant way of identifying people.
Thank you very much for your answers. For actually a very difficult question, indeed. Right now we have like 2 minutes left for last question, if there's some.
15 minutes.
Okay, so please.
If there's time.
Yeah, there's plenty of time.
So in your answer, Alexandra, I mean, I kept thinking about Belarus today as an independent country with its own sense of its own identity. And clearly there must be some linkages between what you're talking about and identity today. So in answering the question that was posed to you, wouldn't one way of doing it be to say, well, how do the Belarusians today think about, their origins, and are their origins these people you're talking about, or these celebrated people? So.
Yeah, that's certainly one perspective, sort of going back or thinking about today. These individuals that I studied are really only celebrated among the Belarusian diaspora. So the Belarusian government in exile that still exists today, their president lives in Toronto. You'll see a lot of the Belarusian community in Canada is very much supportive of these individuals as sort of the carriers of Belarusian nationalism. In Belarus itself, among some very ambitious popular historians, these people resonate very well. But most people, they certainly have gone away from the Soviet narrative. It's not like it was in the late 80s or whatever, when these people were completely marginalized. But I'd say when I speak to a young Belarusian today, they certainly don't identify as being Soviet like they did in the 90s. They identify as being Belarusian. Any connection to these individuals is sort of ambivalent. Most of the stuff that they come across when it comes to these individuals is from sort of popular culture, narrations of Micha Svitushka, which is known as the Belarusian Bandera, and so it's very politicized also in the case of these individuals. in many ways, I would say, I mean, I'm certainly not an expert on contemporary Belarusian identity politics, but there is a sense of, we're not Poles, we're not Russians, we're not, you know, anybody else, we just kind of are. We don't necessarily speak Belarusian, but we can understand it. So it's a very sort of ambiguous sort of identity. Does reflect maybe much of what was happening in this period. And I'm not sure, maybe this will change eventually. It certainly has since the early 90s. But as far as the connection to these individuals, you'll see sort of a very different debate. Either people are really supportive of these individuals and are looking for more archival sources about them, or people just kind of don't really care and think this is a very marginal group that didn't really make much of a difference in terms of Belarusian nationalism.
Thank you. I also have like kind of a provocative question for you. So you got like, there were like two important identities. So one was the religious one and the other one was the national identity. And I would ask which one was the more important one for this community. So was it that there were Protestants or that there were German? Because, and the provocation is when you said that almost like 90% of pastors became like members of the Sudan German Party. So I would say that the national identity, so the German identity would be the case, like the more important one.
Thanks. Well, I always have the perspective of the Czech archives. So in the Czech archives, what I found was exactly what you were saying, that I don't remember the exact quote, but the Czech Protestants in 1945 also recalled that their German brothers and sisters from Sudetenland sort of changed Gottes Glaube for Führer's-Glaube. That was a slogan that appeared in the debates of Czech Synod, of Czech Protestant Synod. So from the perspective of Czech Protestants, it was exactly what happened after 1933 to their German brothers and sisters. And so that was also the phenomenon that drew them apart between 1933 and 1945. And in 1945, they tried to reimagine also the German Protestant church as mainly a Protestant church, not as a German church. But it's a difficult enterprise connecting to this period between 33 and 45, when it was quite explicitly the national dimension that got upper in the self-identifications of German Protestants in the Bohemian lands. But of course, if we would look from the perspective of German archives, it could be a very different story. Yeah.
Thank you. So, if there are really no questions left, I guess that there are plenty of questions left, but we can discuss that during our breakfast break, I would say, which is a little bit longer than it should be, but we will meet again at 11:15 for the next panel. Thank you very much.